Please ask all your questions in the chat. We're at the end of this presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we will aim to answer all of the questions that are input into the chat directly to me and my colleagues. If we have time at the end of this presentation, we will allow people to also unmute and ask their questions directly. And in that case, please refrain your comments to 1 or 2 minutes so that others can also have a chance. And as we talk about our watershed in the city of Boston, which is where this project takes place, I do want to take a moment for a land acknowledgement before we start. We acknowledge that the Charles River watershed resides on the occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. We acknowledge the legacy and trauma that have been inflicted upon the Native tribes in our watershed. We also acknowledge that a land acknowledgement is not enough, and we continue to learn, grow, and listen to Native voices as we advocate for a resilient future. And just a quick overview of our agenda. We'll be covering a background of our organization and the I-90 project. And then GeoSyntec will be presenting on the flooding and environmental impacts analysis for each of the alternatives presented in the NPC. We'll end with a Q&A and how you can submit comments to MassDOT by next week's deadline. And for tonight, your presenters, you will have me. My name is Deirdre Haniff. I am Charles River Watershed Association's Urban Resilience Advocate. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in environmental science and specifically have done research in the field of freshwater toxicology. And our second speaker from GeoSyntec is Renee Bordeaux. She is the senior engineer with GeoSyntec. She is a registered professional civil engineer with 16 years of experience in watershed and municipal planning and design, as well as land use master planning, environmental permitting, and design of stormwater management controls, with a focus on low impact development and green infrastructure techniques. So a little background on us. Charles River Watershed Association is one of the oldest watershed organizations in the country. We were founded in 1965 by a group of residents who did not accept that the Charles cannot be cleaned up. And since then, we have worked with federal, state, and local governments to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River and its watershed through science, advocacy, and the law. We have a group of interdisciplinary staff who support our program areas, which range from river science and restoration to outreach and education. And if you're not too familiar with the watershed, here is a map on the screen showing how widespread the watershed actually is. The river runs 80 miles long, starting from Hopkinton over here, and then flows north towards Boston, which is in the lower basin of the Charles. There are 35 cities and towns in the watershed and over 1 million residents living and playing in the watershed. And I forgot to add, but currently in terms of the I-90 project, it is located right here. Next slide. And our organization has had a long history of advocacy and projects within the watershed that supports our mission. For people in Boston, you might be aware of our advocacy during the Big Dig that led to the Zachem Bridge design. We started a flagging program which notifies boaters and recreational users in the river of the water quality for the day. We were involved in creation of the biggest wetlands in the watershed, which is called the Natural Valley Storage Area. We've also been involved in the largest restoration project in Medfield and also launched a fish restoration program. And all of this is just to show that we've come a long way since the dirty water days, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And for today, the I-90 Allston Multimodal Project, it's a high priority project for us. And on the screen, you'll see the current project sites or the current project site, which is highlighted in the white outline on the map. And this project briefly entails straightening out the Mass Pike and freeing up a number of acres for development. And the area currently is an underutilized former rail yard. And so On top of the development and a new commuter rail stop, any huge improvement to this area will be improved from what the current use of the land is. And just a little background on what is currently the I-90 project area. Salt marshes and meadows historically buffered the Charles River, that's right there, providing natural flood storage and control by storing excess water volume and also helping to filter out nutrients and pollutants. And where the water used to be in this area over here foreshadows some of what we'll be talking about tonight, because water is returning to the spaces it used to be in. And when the project site was undeveloped back then, you would actually expect about only 10% of any rain in the project site to run off into the river, as you can see on this graph on the screen. But in today's developed project site, up to 55% of that water can actually end up as runoff into the river or pool and cause flooding. And that's because in developed landscapes, you have a lot more impervious surfaces, which are your hard surfaces, like our rooftops and our roads and our buildings, that basically act like a rain jacket in our environment. And it reduces the amount of green space and ground cover for water to infiltrate back into the ground, and it exacerbates stormwater runoff and flooding, which can lower the water quality in the river and also prevent safe recreational activities in the river too. And as you can see today, the marshes that used to store floodwater and buffered tides at the project site are now totally impervious roadways. And I've also highlighted in that project site area in yellow what is called the throat area. And this is what the alternatives of the project and today's presentation will focus on. And while we will be mainly focusing on climate vulnerability related to flooding, impervious surfaces do more than just increase runoff and flooding. It can also create urban heat islands effect, which you can see as pockets of red on the map in the neighborhood, which is a result of high percent of impervious surfaces and a lack of trees and green space. So although we will be focusing on flooding, we recognize that this community is also experiencing other impacts of climate change. And we also want to acknowledge that the community is incredibly diverse. It is an environmental justice community and have many socially vulnerable groups. And this neighborhood currently lives with the construction of the Mass Pike and the Soldiers Field Road that have disconnected the community from the river. And so improving connectivity is and should be an important conversation in this project. The current conditions of the project site, specifically near the throat area, currently has bank erosion at where the bike path is. There's trash flowing and flying towards the riverbank and clogging some of the pipes there. There is also currently low connectivity for pedestrians, bikers, and residents from the Allston-Brighton neighborhood to safely and easily make their way towards the river. And for us, what's really important to highlight is there's currently no stormwater treatment at the site. So right now we have an opportunity to turn this into a transformative site that will restore river health, improve connectivity, make the river and parklands more accessible and resilient to extreme storms. And within the past 8 years, CRWA has been involved in the project. We have been members of the I-90 task force since the beginning in 2014, when MassDOT said their preferred design required putting a temporary road in the Charles for 8 to 10 years. We, alongside the boating community and other advocacy groups, said, no way. We did not just spend decades and nearly $1 billion cleaning up the Charles to then stick a road into it. So we led on this No Road in the River campaign and continue to advocate for a design that does not degrade the health of the river. And as we think about this project and as you listen to the rest of the presentation, one of the things we want to stress is that this project has been going on for 8 years. So it started in 2014 when MassDOT presented the current infrastructure and stating that it needs to be fixed. We're currently still very far away from a completed project. MassDOT still has other state and federal environmental review, permitting, and designs to go through, plus the actual construction periods, which might be completed in 2030, maybe 2035. We don't really know at this point. And the project timeline also has been, keeps getting extended. And so we expect this infrastructure to last for 1,500 years. And if the project might not be completed until 2030 or beyond, then the 2050 and 2070 flood predictions are well within the design life of the project and must be accounted for as we think about each alternative and its impact. And with that, I will hand it over to Renee from GeoSyntec.
Great. Thanks, Dira. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Dira mentioned, there are 3 design options for the throat area that we're going to be discussing today that MassDOT has proposed. I will go into greater detail on each of these throat options on the coming slides. The first option in the top left is a modified highway viaduct. The next one is a modified at grade, and the final one is the Soldiers Field Road hybrid. Next slide. So the modified highway viaduct is shown here in a cross section that comes directly from the notice of project change, includes a new I-90 elevated structure to replace the existing I-90 viaduct structure, while all other transportation infrastructure remains at grade. So very similar to what is currently there now. MassDOT recently made changes to the design to include a narrower viaduct, which opened up additional open space along the Charles River within the throat area. The Paul Dudley White path would provide 10-foot wide separated bike and pedestrian facilities within a majority of the throat area, and a minimum of 12-foot cross section where separated facilities cannot be provided. This option allows for pedestrian and bike connection from the Allston-Brighton, Brookline, and Boston University neighborhoods to the Charles River Reservation. The Worcester Main Line and the Grand Junction rail tracks would remain at grade similar to their existing horizontal alignment, with extensions of the Grand Junction rail line into West Station. The existing Grand Junction bridge over Soldiers Field Road will remain unimpacted. And the MBTA commuter rail lines would remain adjacent to the existing right-of-way line with Boston University property to the south. Next slide. The next option we call the modified at grade option. This is an at-grade design which proposes to reconstruct I-90 at grade or below grade to eliminate the viaduct and retain all other transportation infrastructure at grade, with the exception of a short length of Grand Junction rail track as it passes over I-90 and Soldiers Field Road after raising an elevation in a parallel alignment. The modified at grade option allows for pedestrian and bicycle connection from neighborhoods in Allston-Brighton, Brookline, and BU to the Charles River Reservation. The Paul Dudley White path would be 20 feet wide on a boardwalk structure over the Charles River in the throat area. Design as a modified at grade improves the visual quality for the neighborhood beyond existing conditions by removal of the visual barrier of the viaduct and providing enhanced neighborhood views. The Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, has raised concern with this option, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. Where a section of I-90 is within the 50-year rainfall floodplain. And during that 50-year rainfall event, a section of this would potentially flood. And so they've raised concern with that. Next slide. The last option is a Soldiers Field Road hybrid, which we'll refer to as the SFR hybrid. And it proposes to stack Soldiers Field Road above an at-grade, below-grade 4-lane section of the I-90 eastbound travel lanes and shoulders. This hybrid option allows for a bicycle and pedestrian connection from neighborhoods in Allston, Brighton, Brookline, and BU to the Charles River Reservation. The Paul Dudley White path would remain at grade, providing separate paths for bicycle and pedestrian uses. Each path would be approximately 10 feet wide, with a 4-foot wide buffer between the pedestrian and the bicycle path. This option opens up almost 20 feet of new park space adjacent to the Charles River. Construction for this option is estimated to be the longest at approximately 8 to 9 years, and construction staging of this option would require relocation of Soldiers Field Road and the Paul Budley White Path over the Charles River, resulting in construction duration impacts of the Charles River, which we'll get into a little bit as we move forward here. Next slide. So this slide talks slightly about sort of what our role was for this scope. So the scope of our work was to include an understanding of the potential impacts this MassDOT project would have on flooding, the health of the Charles River, access to the river, impacts to recreation and quality of life. We also provided potential opportunities to Charles River Watershed Association of what could be considered by MassDOT, and it's also a series of considerations. As part of the review, we have listed here some documents that we reviewed, which provided the content for our discussion today. These resources include some online viewers with regards to future sea level rise and coastal flooding predictions. We reviewed technical memorandums and reports prepared by the MassDOT team on the project. We also looked at MassDOT GIS for transportation, and then ultimately relied heavily on the most recent document that was published in July 2022, which is a notice of project change, including all of its appendices. We will be describing a lot of technical content in the coming slides, most of which is available within the notice of project change that is available on the project website. Additionally, as Dira stated, you can type questions in the chat, and if they aren't answered at the conclusion of our presentation, we'll work on following up on some of those questions. So we're going to start this conversation about the potential impacts on flooding. Next slide, please. So in the present day, as most of you are probably aware, the Allston-Brighton area is not immune to climate vulnerabilities. There are commonly stories in the news, and even today and yesterday, about flash flooding, storm events from severe wet storms and hurricanes, frozen pipes and infrastructure, and ultimately, we don't anticipate these vulnerabilities going away. We anticipate that potentially these will become worse over time. As Dira stated, infrastructure projects like this don't come around very often. The existing viaduct was built in the 1960s, and for the past 20 years, MassDOT has been talking about replacing it. Again, that's going on 62 years. Most new highway bridges and infrastructure have a lifespan of 50 to 100 years and typically push the upper range of 75 to 100 years. So once this infrastructure is in place, it is here to stay and will likely see many of the future flooding impacts and climate vulnerabilities that we're going to discuss today. Next slide. So when we talk about flooding in the Charles River, many people simply say, well, we have the Charles River Dam. We don't need to worry about sea level rise impacts. Just a little history on the Charles River Dam. The Charles River Dam was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1978 to replace the 1910 Charles River Dam, which is upstream and now the site of the Boston Museum of Science. The dam controls the surface level of the river basin, as well as its tributaries upstream, and prevents seawater from entering the Charles River Basin during high tides. Based on recent inspections of the dam, it is rated as a high hazard dam and in poor condition by the Office of Dam Safety. Additionally, based on recent projections and studies of impacts of coastal flooding in Boston and Cambridge, the dam is likely to be overtopped by 2065 during the 100-year storm, and as soon as 2050 during the 500-year storm. The dam could be flanked as early as 2045, which is a mere 23 years away, under the 500-year storm, and in 2055 during the 100-year storm. All of these events are well within the 75 to 100-year lifespan of this infrastructure. Currently, the Army Corps of Engineers and Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation are developing a study to assess the potential climate resiliency of the Charles River Dam. However, the results, timeline, and cost for implementation of such a project are all unknown. Next slide. So setting the stage for the next couple of slides, in the previous slide, Sarah showed you where the throat area was. And in the red box here, we're going to focus on some cross sections for each of the three alternatives. Section 1 is on the far left of the red box, and section 4 is on the far right of the red box, which is closest to the BU Bridge. Next slide. So section 4, again, which is closest to the BU bridge, will be at the top of the screen. And section 1, which was on the far left of the box we just previously showed, will be at the bottom of the screen. The upper yellow lines, which are going to be hard to see, and I do apologize, are for the 2070, the climate vulnerability associated with the year 2070, and the blue lines are with 2050. And ultimately, the thing to focus on here is the blue shading, which represents land underwater under these conditions. The cross-sectional figures are directly out of the notice of project change for each of the scenarios, and we'll start with a modified highway viaduct. And remember, this is an option which is similar to what it currently exists today. It's almost essentially rebuilding what is there. And what you can see from this is this figure really demonstrates the potential vulnerability of the eastern portion of the throat area and shows that the Paul Dudley White Path and Soldiers Field Road westbound and eastbound are vulnerable to flooding in both 2050 and 2070. The Grand Junction Railroad and Worcester Main Line are also potentially vulnerable to flooding in 2050 and 2070, depending on the locations throughout that section. Under this build alternative, most of I-90 is not vulnerable to future flooding due to the elevated viaduct design. And as we understand that this is still in conceptual design and final grading is not complete. The current layout is not expected to significantly mitigate future flooding in the northern portion of the project area. But the railways below the viaduct may provide some flood protection to the vulnerability of the BU campus, essentially acting as a wall. Next slide. Okay, the next option is a modified at grade option. This option is not expected to significantly mitigate future flooding in the northern portion of the project area, but the elevated fill railway may provide some flooding protection to the vulnerable portion of the Boston University campus. As you can see here, this is the option where all of the vehicular transportation is at grade. The cross-section demonstrates the potentially vulnerable eastern portion of the throat and shows that the Paul Dudley White Pathway, Soldiers Field Road, both westbound and eastbound, and I-90 westbound and eastbound are vulnerable to flooding in 2050 and 2070. The Grand Junction Railroad and the Worcester Main Lines are both elevated on fill or protected by other elevated landforms and are not vulnerable to future coastal flooding as currently designed. And although I-90 in the eastern end is inland on an elevated landscape feature in the Grand Junction Rail berm, there is a potential for flooding in western portions of the I-90 layout to convey eastward, flanking the elevated Grand Junction berm and inundating I-90. So as you notice, all vehicular traffic in this scenario would be underwater. Next slide. This is the Soldiers Field Road hybrid option. The cross-sectional figure demonstrates the potentially vulnerable eastern portion of the throat and shows that the Paul Dudley White Path, Soldiers Field Road westbound and eastbound, and I-90 westbound and eastbound are vulnerable to flooding in 2050 and 2070. The Grand Junction Rail and Worcester Main Lines are both elevated on fill and not vulnerable to coastal flooding. Although I-90 in the western end is inland on an elevated landscape feature, there is potential for flooding in the western portion of I-90. In all cases, if the Charles River Dam were to be topped or overflanked, each of the throat options would have vulnerable structures and vehicular traffic underwater, making this infrastructure unusable in the future. In many of these options, we have to ask ourselves from a public safety standpoint, how does one evacuate Boston if all vehicular train traffic in lanes are inundated with water? Next option, next slide. Next, we're going to move to some of the impacts of Charles River health. So EPA defined the Charles River as a rating of B, which is basically meeting almost all water quality standards for both boating and swimming. The riverbed has been vulnerable to algae blooms due to excessive phosphorus levels from stormwater runoff, which has become an area of concern. The biggest concerns for future water quality are stormwater pollution and the projected extreme weather events due to climate change. EPA defines the presence of phosphorus in the river into three main categories: influence in the upstream watershed of the Watertown Dam, non-combined sewer overflow from drainage areas and tributaries, and non-combined sewer overflow discharges. Resiliency to current and future weather events is key to maintaining the Charles River as a safe recreational location and ecological habitat. Next slide. For the next few slides, I'll be focusing on a few of the terms for our discussion that I want to review with you related to the wetlands, waterway, and ecological impacts. And then the next slide is just a zoom in of the box in the top right. Next slide, please. We're going to be talking, you'll hear me say words such as bordering land subject to flooding. The bordering land subject to flooding is the yellow area between the red line and the green line adjacent to the river line. And it's represented as the land when the 100-year floodplain is mapped by FEMA. This area is presumed significant to flood control and storm damage protection. We'll also be referring to inland bank, which is the area in the green shaded, which is a landform that confines the river and is typically between the floodplain and the water body. Next slide. So when we look at the three options, again, these are the ones we've presented earlier. We're going to talk about what the potential impacts are to each of these resource areas I just looked at. So for the modified highway viaduct, again, this is the option that's very similar to what exists there today, which is replacing the existing viaduct. There's really only permanent impacts to tidelands, and this primarily associated with stormwater outfalls and their associated energy dissipation that will be required. This is consistent with all three options. Basically, MassDOT is going to go in and make upgrades to all of their stormwater outfalls and create energy dissipation to reduce erosion along the stream bank. This is a very positive thing, and really the only permanent impact with regards to the highway viaduct option. There'll be no permanent fill within the bordering land subject to flooding. And the riverbank improvements will be with native species and basically trying to recreate a riverbank that was there and consistent prior to development. And there'll be no permanent impacts to navigation associated with the modified highway viaduct option. Next, moving to the orange box in the center, the modified at grade. Again, to remind everyone, this is bringing all of the lanes of traffic, vehicular traffic, to at grade. So it'll be 12 lanes of traffic. And this is where the Paul Dudley White pathway, bike pathway, and pedestrian pathway would be over the Charles River. Again, there's the permanent impacts to tidelands from the outfalls, consistent with all three options. The walkway and the piers associated with that will have permanent impacts to the river. There'll be 500 square feet of land underwater and 200 square feet of impacts to that inland bank. There's no restoration of the existing riverbank possible without adding fill to the river and losing navigable river, which would require solid fill of approximately 4,300 square feet. Additionally, there'll be 300 square feet of fill in the bordering land subject to flooding to accommodate Soldiers Field Road, which will be moving closer to the Charles River. All of these impacts have potential to remove feeding zones for seasonal fish runs, especially in the area that will be covered by the Paul Dudley White pathway. And as I previously mentioned in the earlier slides, the Federal Highway Administration has concern with the 50-year flood, with likely portions of it of I-90. And finally, in the blue box off to the right, the impacts from the Soldiers Field Road hybrid option. The permanent impacts associated with the tidelands for the outfalls, again, consistent with all three options. As stated previously, the biggest impact from this option is the temporary construction impacts, which are associated with relocating the Paul Dudley White pathway and Soldiers Field Road over the Charles River. From a water quality standpoint, that's something we can talk a lot about what those potential impacts are and how snow would be managed. But they would also have fisheries impact and impacts to navigation, and they would be installed for a very long time. They refer to a lot as temporary impacts. However, the regulatory agencies define temporary as 6 months to 12 months, and this road would be in place for 8 to 9 years. Next slide. For the open space and potential recreation impacts, again, we'll talk about the three options. In the green box is a modified highway viaduct option. To our open space and recreation, there'll be permanent impacts from the I-90 piers, which will be associated with the 500 square feet permanent impacts. Additionally, from the overhang associated with the viaduct, there'll be indirect effects on 4,900 square feet of parkland through the overhang. This is currently now inaccessible parkland. However, this option will create 4.5 acres of new parkland, and the PWY, the Paul Dudley White pathway, would be widened. And we've included a little I think some of it's being cut off, but we've included a little Fenway Park to demonstrate in the non-shaded area how much new parkland would be available under each option. In the yellow box, the modified at grade, again, the Paul W. White pathway would be relocated into the Charles River, which would remove 1 acre of recreational water. 1.3 acres of permanent parkland would be converted to highway, and 3.6 acres of parkland would be, through the removal of the Houghton chemical land and addition of the boardwalk, would be created. So this would have about 3.6 acres of creation, which would be about 43% of Fenway Park. And finally, in the blue box for the Soldiers Field Road hybrid option, 1.5 acres of parkland would be occupied from relocated highways, and 4.2 acres of water sheet, again, this is a water surface, would be temporarily impacted due to the construction period at point which the Paul W. White Path and Soldiers Field Road would be temporarily located over the Charles River. However, this option does have the greatest impact with additions of 6.1 acres of new parkland, or 72% of Fenway Park. Next slide. We're going to move to talk about stormwater management. So the project qualifies as a redevelopment project under the Massachusetts stormwater standards because it results in an overall decrease in impervious cover compared to proposed conditions. And again, this includes the throat and the area outside of the throat, which we're not talking about in great detail today. General stormwater treatment used for the project prioritizes the use of low impact development or green infrastructure, including rain gardens and bioretention areas, and uses larger treatment practices to meet peak rate attenuation, recharge, and water quality treatment with a focus on phosphorus, nitrogen, metals, pathogens, and total suspended solids. Next slide. So again, we're going to focus on the 3 options, and we're going to go into detail with sort of what is provided from a stormwater management perspective for each of these options. You'll notice some color shading on your screen, which is associated with different proposed practices, but what you should really be focusing on is there's a pink shading that represents untreatable impervious pavement. And you'll see as we go through these options how that changes. And so for this option, you can note that what the proposed team treats 97% of the pervious area within the throat. So there's very little pink area. They've created more open space on the riverside, resulting in a greater opportunity to treat stormwater in the throat area. Stormwater treatment bases along the eastern edge of the throat area between the Grand Junction rail line and Soldiers Field Road will treat runoff from Soldiers Field Road. The basin is proposed as either bioretention or infiltration basin. And rain garden planters are also proposed within the park to treat stormwater runoff from the Paul W. White pathway. And stormwater runoff from I-90 would be treated underneath the viaduct in an infiltration swale. Next slide. Again, just refreshing everyone's memory, the pink area noted on the slide represents the untreatable impervious pavement. So this is a modified at grade option, which would allow treatment of stormwater runoff from Soldiers Field Road at a new bioretention infiltration facility located at the eastern edge of the throat area between the Grand Junction rail line and Soldiers Field Road. Given the proposed cross-section to the throat area for this option, there is no space available to add rain garden planters for the path system. The proposed profile and grading of I-90 for this option precludes the opportunity to treat stormwater runoff from the interstate roadway, having it be all at grade. So the modified at grade option would require pumping to drain the I-90 roadway because the drainage system would be below the elevation of the Charles River. This option would provide approximately 35% treatment for the impervious area within the throat section. And for comparisons, if you remember, the previous slide was 97%. Next option. For the Soldiers Field Road option, this would create enough open space in the throat area to provide stormwater treatment for runoff. And again, I apologize, the pink area, just for everyone's reference, again, is the untreatable impervious area associated with the project. Similar to the modified highway viaduct option, which is our first option, rain garden planters would be designed to treat path runoff from the Paulderley White Path, and a bioretention and infiltration facility is proposed to treat runoff from Soldiers Field Road. The proposed profile and grading of I-90 for this option precludes the opportunity to treat stormwater runoff from I-90 roadway. This option again would require pumping because the drainage system would be below the elevation of the Charles River. This hybrid option treats approximately 52% of the impervious area within the throat section. So as a summary of the proposed build alternatives, the modified highway viaduct provides the greatest opportunity for water quality improvement with a treatment of 97% compared to the other options. And the modified at grade and the Soldiers Field Road hybrid are more than the modified viaduct option because they both require stormwater pumps. Next option, next slide. So we want to talk about some potential impacts of human connectivity to the Charles River. So all the throat options have a very similar connection to the river and over Soldiers Field Road at the new development site. And questions to sort of ask yourself in some of these is your view from Allston really connecting you to the river if you can see cars in front of the Charles? And is a footbridge easier and more ADA accessible than at grade walking? And our road noise is more connecting than nature and having easy walking access to the Charles. When we consider each of these options, whether all the transportation is at grade, there's many people saying, well, it's not a visual barrier anymore having the viaduct. However, things you should consider are the trade-offs associated with the environment worth it for all of these other considerations? Next slide. So in summary, just to review what we just discussed and compare the three options, we've created a quick summary slide. So on the left in the first column, we have the three options. The modified highway viaduct is the first row. The second row is the modified at grade, where all 12 vehicular lanes are at grade. And then we finally have the Soldiers Field Road hybrid. When you look at the future flooding potential, how we rank this from low to high, we ranked low being that 4 lanes of traffic would be inundated with water under the 2050 and 2070 scenarios. Moderate would be that 8 lanes of vehicular traffic would be inundated under the 2050 and 2070 scenarios. And high, that all 12 lanes of traffic with no safe means for vehicular traffic or emergency evacuation would be underwater. So as you can see, from a future flooding potential, the modified highway viaduct has the lowest potential for future flooding, and the modified at grade has the highest. In the second column, under stormwater management and water quality, the modified highway viaduct provides 97% treatment of impervious cover, the modified at grade 35%, in Soldiers Field Road hybrid 52%. Under the waterways and ecological impacts, under the modified highway viaduct, there's no fill in the riverbank. In the modified at grade, there's fill from the boardwalk in the river, and there's removal of fish and feeding ground. And for Soldiers Field Road, again, there's that temporary road in the river for 8 to 9 years. Due to some time constraints here, I'm going to skip on to the next slide. Opportunities. So how do we move forward, and what opportunities does MassDOT have to create more resilient designs to flooding? So one option is they could elevate the roadways or the Paulderley White Path to be less exposed to future flooding. Number 2 is to build a flood barrier between the roadways. And the 3 is to increase elevations of the landscape elements. Next slide. Opportunities to maximize treatment of stormwater runoff from the site. We can increase green and impervious areas, providing additional locations where we could treat stormwater runoff. For those sites where we need to pump stormwater, are there opportunities to pump stormwater through a BMP prior to discharging the river to provide water quality treatment for all those areas we saw in pink? And ultimately, allow no temporary roads to be built over the Charles River. Next slide. Additional opportunities to minimize during construction and permanent impacts to the Charles River. We're concerned about having no permanent fill impacts. So implement a throat option with no permanent fill within that bordering land subject to flooding. For impacts to navigation, the Charles River is a prized resource for the community and used by boaters daily. We need to implement a throat option with no permanent impacts to navigation in the Charles River. The modified at grade option, as we mentioned, has the most permanent impacts to water and wetland resources. We need to provide mitigation for these that will result in reduced recreational use. So we need to select the throat option that reduces the overall long-term impacts to the waterway and wetland resources. For many of these options, they've talked about living shorelines or a potential retaining wall will provide permanent impacts to fisheries, remove feeding zones for domesticated seasonal fish runs. We need additional details to really understand the impact of these potential environmental trade-offs. And the last slide I have, next one. Some real outstanding questions for MassDOT, and there's more than just listed here, but because it's due to time, we're just going to talk about these, is to really consider the impact of the Charles River Dam overtopping and flanking. As we mentioned here, these risks are really predicated to be within the next 30 years. And there's no commitments to upgrading the dam or resolving these future risks at the current moment. According to the schedule proposed in the notice of project change, they're substantially completing the environmental review process by summer of 2024 and anticipate commencing construction in 2025. MassDOT should really be required to implement a design that provides redundancy and reduces the future risk of flooding, other than relying on the Charles River Dam as a complete unknown on whether an implementation project will move forward. Additionally, MassDOT should incorporate mitigation measures. So they should be required to design and accommodate future measures. If the money is not there now to implement the measures, they should be providing locations or area to support those, such as flood barrier walls. And to get a better understanding of the potential environmental impacts and trade-offs associated to make these transportation infrastructure more resilient. There will need to be, if we need to accommodate flood walls and building berms, et cetera, there will be potential additional environmental impacts that aren't discussed here today. And the federal and state highway and DOT strategic plans and regulations commit to early planning and access and accessibility during extreme weather vulnerabilities. And ultimately, the protection of the public safety. MassDOT does not describe how during extreme rain events, hurricanes, sea level rise, and storm surge, the public will evacuate if portions of the proposed roadways are flooded or inundated. That's all I have there.
Thanks, Renee. Let me add my pen. So before we conclude to our Q&A session, I do want to bring us back to why we had this presentation in the first place. So the project currently is in its notice of project change review period under the MEPA environmental review process, which is Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. And the deadline for the comment period is next Tuesday. We are currently working on a template that we will be able to share with everyone who registered today that will include some of the information that we shared with you tonight. But on top of that, we do encourage you to tell your story and voice your concerns and ask questions about the project. If you rode, bike, or walk, or even drive along the river, this is really your time to tell MassDOT what kind of resilient transportation system this area needs. So we'll be able to share that with everyone tomorrow in a follow-up email, as well as the recording of tonight's presentation. And so if anyone doesn't get that tomorrow, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I have my information on the slide here. But I am now going to open it to some of the questions that we got in the chat. Again, we'll prioritize some of the chat questions first, and if we have extra time, people can unmute and ask questions or continue to add to the chat. Please send it directly to me or Heather Miller on the list. You should see her and my name in the chat box. But one of the first questions we got, can you clarify whether fill is measured in cubic feet or square feet? I believe MassDOT uses both measurements in the NPC. Renee, do you have any other comments? That is
correct. Yep. And the notice of project change is listed as both square feet and cubic feet. You can find both in there.
Great. And I've seen some comments pop up for me as well, asking kind of the pros and cons of each of the options throughout the presentation. And I think Renee kind of gave a really great summary of what all of those different options mean for the river in terms of flooding impacts and connectivity. Obviously, there are trade-offs with each of the options, and flooding is going to happen. So we do need to prepare for it despite, whichever option we choose, MassDOT chooses. And again, we will follow up with an email with all the slide decks, so you will have access to the information that was shared today too. Another question that came up in the chat, maybe Renee, you could address this one, is some people have questions in terms of stormwater flooding. We know that it's already an issue in this area. The question was, has MassDOT looked at future stormwater flooding in addition to flooding from sea level rise and coastal storms? And when we factor in stormwater inundation, will flooding be even worse than what MassDOT is predicting based on sea level rise?
Yep, so MassDOT has looked at the current flooding situation, and in some of those areas there will be proposed pumping, as I identified in there. So in areas that are low lying and can't be treated via gravity, there would be pumping. Currently, the locations where there will be pumping stormwater, they are not providing treatment for that. With regards to a more extreme rain events in the future, they have looked at more extreme precipitation events. However, with regards to design criteria, they are looking at a 50-year current storm and not necessarily a 50-year projected storm. Additionally, the stormwater infrastructure that exists there to date was designed for an existing, it's probably from the 70s actually, or even earlier, because it was built in the 60s, a 10-year storm from then. And so they have not talked about potential upgrades to stormwater infrastructure that currently exists in locations where they would utilize that existing infrastructure and how that would be upgraded for future predictions of precipitation. So some of that is still a little bit unknown.
Great, thank you. And similar to kind of flooding, I guess not very similar, but in your review of all of the documents, has MassDOT distinguished between green space and open space? I think in some other projects, they have been used interchangeably, but obviously we understand that green space should mean green space in terms of pervious, actual natural landscape versus open space. Has that been clarified by MassDOT?
I'd have to go back and look. I know that a lot of the open space, they even consider sort of, when they look at the parklands, they do consider Soldiers Field Road part of a parkland, I believe. Even though it is impervious cover, because it is sort of a, owned by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I don't know if they specifically called out differences between physical green space and open space. I would need to go back and double check the notice of project change. From my recollection, I don't believe they quantified the quantities that way. I think they just kept it as open space in general.
Great, thank you. That was a really good question too. Another from the chat, could a lane reduction scenario be analyzed? So for this question, I believe MassDOT has refused to look at this to date, but we have been asking them for years to look at lane reduction, and we will continue to make that request in our comments for the NPC. But even with lane reduction, a lot of these flooding issues would still exist because of the elevation of where the Mass Pike and I-90 would be. And so there's still a lot of work to think about flood mitigation, even with lane reduction for this project. Another question. What role does Boston Water and Sewer Commission have with the mitigation of stormwater runoff and flooding? So there are a lot of entities with responsibility for stormwater in this area. And I'm not sure, Renee, if you know more than that or can provide more description than that.
Yep, yeah, so Boston Water Sewer would be responsible for their infrastructure that they own on the project. And ultimately, any stormwater runoff generated by MassDOT that would enter Boston Water and Sewer's infrastructure, there would need to be an agreement in place, between them, and typically they're typically called interconnections, where MassDOT would be required to sort of meet any sort of state standards prior to discharging through Boston Water and Sewer infrastructure. As Dira mentioned, there's a lot of parties with infrastructure that runs under this whole corridor that needs to be coordinated. So Boston Water and Sewer would ultimately be at the table as this project moves forward, and really what the impacts would be on their infrastructure and potentially additional stormwater runoff and or pollutants entering their system.
So it's a complicated topic.
It is complicated.
All right, so another question that came up is relationships between all of the development and redevelopment happening west of the Throat, and flooding issues, stormwater pollution in the I-90 area. So I think the person is asking what is the relationship in terms of flooding when all of these projects are going to be developed or redeveloped. And that's something that we have questions on too. Obviously for tonight's scope, it does not include or did not include those other redevelopment projects, but it is a question that we will also ask in our comment letter and continue to get clarifications on. Because we know that obviously climate change, is going to impact everywhere, and water will go where it wants to. And if one area is being developed, adding more impervious surface, that could impact what happens downstream. And for the I-90 project, it is really located downstream of the Charles River. And so things that happen outside or upstream of that can have an impact on what's going to happen there. Okay, another question. How will groundwater levels be affected by the extensive development in this area? I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure, Renee, if you guys took a look at that for the scope.
We didn't. My understanding is I don't believe many sections would be far below existing grades. So, obviously stormwater is a problem in areas where they'd be putting tunnels in and et cetera, they'd be kind of lining them. So, I think with regards to infiltrating stormwater, there is a potential to have some, groundwater rise, localized groundwater rise in the locations where there's stormwater infrastructure proposed that would infiltrate. However, I think that would be pretty minimal and potentially be uptaken by, many of the planted features around it. But I think because it's such a highly developed area to begin with, again, we didn't get into great detail on this, and I don't think there's a lot of discussion in the NPC about it. I think it's hard to say, but I don't anticipate they would be drastically different than now, unless there'd be a lot of subsurface additional infrastructure proposed, which I don't believe there is compared to what's existing there today.
Right, yeah, I know in this neighborhood, people have lots of questions about groundwater, and it's definitely a concern for many residents. And that could potentially be a question if you were to submit a comment to MassDOT in the MPC that you could ask them to have more clarification on. Because, we don't want flooding to happen on the roads, but also nothing happening in homes and basements either.
Dira, I would add to that, Dira, I'll just add to that, there are anticipated, groundwater elevation changes associated with sea level rise and climate change. So, those, predictions could, whether the project is there today or not, if it never changes, those would still be issues. So that's something also to consider is, just through climate change itself, with or without this proposed project, what those impacts would be with groundwater levels.
Great, thank you. And then there was another question in regards to relationships of this project with other developments or redevelopment happening, especially in terms of the Harvard Enterprise Project. Someone's question / comment was that there is potential on Harvard's land for flood mitigation. Do we know what their plan is for this yet? So I don't believe we know if there is a full kind of coordination between MassDOT and Harvard. Renee's shaking her head, so I'm going to say no. That discusses flood mitigation, but that is also, again, a question that we have and a question that you can also ask in the comment letter when you submit for the NPC. And then this one question, someone asked if we could talk more about the difference between the 2050 and 2070 flood predictions, and if we could summarize the different options as it relates to each prediction. So I can pull one of your slide decks, Renee, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Would this one work, or do you have a preference for a different slide?
No, that's fine. So what was the question, just to talk about the differences between each option?
Yeah, the difference between a 2070 2050, maybe in terms of, if you have it on you, maybe how much rain we're actually getting. And
so this would be sea level rise. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And there's two occurrences. So there's one during the 100-year storm and one during the 500-year storm. And I know it's kind of hard to see. The first blue line would be sort of the 100-year storm, and the second would be the 500-year storm. When you look at these, I mean, there's minor differences in elevation associated with each of these. I think with regards, things to focus on, is that, when you look at the blue line, you can look at the bottom blue line, and again, it might be worthwhile going to the notice of project change and actually pulling up these figures and seeing where that blue line falls under the 2050 scenario. But it is in most of these scenarios, especially under this one, I mean, it's well over the whales, sometimes over the windshield of where you would potentially see flooding associated with this. And obviously the yellow thicker lines are far above that in some of these scenarios. So, I mean, I think the big takeaway here is that really in almost all of these options, there's very vulnerable transportation corridors where there's significant flooding, where there wouldn't be able to be any vehicles located on it. In the option that's up here, the hybrid, I mean, if you look, when you look at the blue lines in section 3, which is the second one down, I mean, the vehicle is completely submerged, and you're not even at the 2050. So, in almost all of these scenarios for this one, at the 2050, I mean, almost all the vehicles are primarily submerged. So, while there is some elevation differences between the two, using the least significant